We'd like to talk about resources in the ocean and then get into some specific examples. And one thing we want to distinguish is between extractive and non-extractive resources. And extractive resources are those resources that are actually removed from the sea, whether it's material or energy. Fish, metals, minerals, sand, salt, for example, are all things taken out of the ocean, but energy could be using the thermal energy in the ocean or wave power. Non-extractive resources involve those things using the resource in place. Nothing is removed. Examples would be using the ocean for transportation or for recreation, whether it's surfing or boating or sailing or scuba diving. Of course, recreational fishing, if you keep those fish, that is extractive. But just the enjoyment of the ocean is non-extractive. Now, when we talk about these extractive resources, we can also characterize them or distinguish them as either renewable or non-renewable. And a renewable resource is a resource that is able to replenish itself on a reasonable short time frame. For example, timber or trees or fish from the ocean. These things are renewable. They regenerate themselves, they can grow. But things like oil, coal, all these fossil fuels, and things like manganese nodules, which grow incredibly slowly, millimeters over the course of millions of years, these things took very, very long time to be formed, and we're using them at rates that are much faster than they were made. So they are effectively non-renewable. And then we can talk about sustainable versus unsustainable. Is the resource being extracted at a rate that's slower than it replenishes itself? If yes, then we can say it's sustainable. For instance, if we're taking fish from the sea at a rate that's slower than they're able to reproduce and grow, that would be sustainable. It could also be sustainable if it's non-renewable, if the amount we're taking is trivial compared to the vast amounts of resource that are there. We also probably want to factor in for sustainability, not just the resource itself, but what goes into harvesting that resource to determine whether it's a sustainable practice or not. If harvesting something isn't using up a large amount of it, but is devastating to the environment and many other resources, then I think we would have to consider that unsustainable. We gave an example of a resource in a previous module, and that was fisheries, which, as we mentioned, is renewable, but we saw how the rate of capture of wild fish has maxed out, and yet the effort to catch those fish has continued to increase. And many of the fisheries are either now being overexploited beyond their maximum sustainable yield, or they're just at that threshold. And a very small percentage of the fisheries are below their maximum sustainable yield. So I'd have to say that our fisheries, unfortunately at this point, although they are renewable, are being fished unsustainably. And many fishing practices are also environmentally damaging, like bottom trawling for bottom fish and shrimp, devastating to the seafloor. There are individual fisheries that are well managed and sustainable and have low environmental impact, but many of them are currently unsustainable or environmentally devastating. And we also saw how aquaculture is making up that deficit as the population continues to grow. We're not getting more wild fish out of the sea, but fish farms are contributing more and more. Unfortunately, much of that aquaculture activity is environmentally damaging, not all of it. So it's really tricky to know which fisheries are well managed and sustainable, which aquaculture products are not doing undue damage to the environment. But it is important for all of us to make the best choices, and fortunately there are resources around to help you make those choices. This app, for example, the Seafood Watch app, which is produced by the Monterey Bay Aquarium, is a very handy guide to help you make the best choices. So that's an example of a biological renewable resource, which could be sustainable, and that's what we're striving for. I want to give you a very different example, and that is a non-biological resource or a mineral resource from the ocean. And I'm specifically going to talk about metals as an extractive resource example. Now, the growth of new technologies, and this includes green technologies, which we're all excited about and hope will usher in a new era of sustainability and minimizing our influence on global climate change. But even these green technologies rely on critical mineral resources, things like cobalt, nickel, manganese, copper, used for wires, and battery for storage of solar and wind power, and the batteries to power the cars and the phones and the computers. These are critical metals, and mining them from land sources has its own environmental consequences and instabilities. A lot of the cobalt, for example, is being mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is politically unstable, also uses child labor under dangerous conditions. So why not look for alternative sources? And it turns out the seafloor has more of these metals than any of the sources on land. So it's a rich source of these metals in the form of polymetallic sulfide deposits at hydrothermal vents, cobalt-rich crusts around seamounts, and these manganese nodules, also referred to as polymetallic nodules because they do have more than manganese in them, that are over vast areas of the abyssal plains, as you see on the right there. Because there is a rich resource of metals down there on the seafloor, there have been decades of speculation and dreaming, but we are now approaching this point where things are starting to heat up and these efforts are gaining momentum. The International Seabed Authority, which is an intergovernmental agency established by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1994 to manage the resources of the seafloor that lie in international waters, has granted permits for exploration. 21 of these so far. And the activities at this point are exploratory, although mining activities have happened in the territorial waters of some countries. But in the international waters, this is an exploratory phase. And there is a lot of concern in the oceanographic community that the environmental effects of mining the seafloor could be widespread and devastating. Here's a map showing the locations of these mineral resources. In blue, we see areas where there are polymetallic nodules, or these manganese nodules. In the orange dots, we see the polymetallic sulfides at hydrothermal vents and the cobalt-rich crusts in yellow. In the white, you'll see the exclusive economic zones around these land masses, which do not fall under the International Seabed Authority, but other areas do. So one of the first targets by one of the earliest companies to get into deep-sea mining game was targeting this Solwara 1 here off the coast of Papua New Guinea, and the idea was to go for these polymetallic sulfides around vents, which have silver, gold, and copper in them. And this company was one of the first to start investing in this, Nautilus Minerals in Canada, and you'll see they went so far as to build these behemoth machines. They look terrifying, to go down and tear up the seafloor to mine these dormant vent fields. The company, though, faced tremendous and relentless community opposition, lawsuits, and appeals to the government, and also suffered various operational issues, and investors lost confidence in the venture, and the company has since been liquidated, leaving, unfortunately, Papua New Guinea saddled with quite a bit of debt. That's not the end of it, though. In international waters, one of the primary targets people are looking at for mining is the Clarion-Clipperton zone, shown right here, in the middle of the Pacific, just to the south and east of the Hawaiian island chain. This is an area, large area, covered with polymetallic nodules, as shown here. They're called polymetallic nodules because in addition to the manganese, they also have nickel, copper, cobalt, and a lot of these minerals are found at higher percentage concentrations than are found in the ores mined on land. So there's a lot of interest, and the International Seabed Authority has granted exploration contracts to 16 companies from over a dozen different countries. In the yellow are reserved areas, but all the other colors that you see there are from over a dozen different countries that have applied for and gotten permits to do exploration in their little patch of the seafloor. And you will see perhaps that the U.S. is not among those because the U.S. never ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty and only has observer status. The equipment that's being built to harvest these polymetallic nodules doesn't look quite as scary as the equipment that was built to mine the dormant vents by Nautilus Minerals. These are designed to be more like vacuum cleaners, in a sense. Even so, they're likely to do a tremendous amount of damage to the seafloor where they mine. So this is an example of an actual prototype. Here we'll see a little video clip from the MIT Mechanical Engineering Group, an animation showing what the operation looks like. So you have a vessel that takes the mining vehicle out and lowers it down to the seafloor. It hits the seafloor and just runs patterns back and forth, digging up these nodules that sit at the surface, but lifting them up out of the sediments. They get pumped up to the ship, separate the nodules from the sediment, and then the sediment gets pumped back down and released in the midwater. So we have both a collector plume and a discharge plume coming from this mining operation. So as I mentioned, a lot of these permits are exploratory permits so far, and there's been an emphasis on doing research initially to figure out what the biodiversity is in these areas. And that's a good thing because a lot of this area is unexplored, and in recent expeditions to this area, many new undescribed species were observed. And we have a lot of this activity being done right here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, this exploratory research to understand the diversity before these machines go down and start plowing it up, if they ever do. And what's being found is that there's still so much down there that we have yet to describe. It's extraordinary diversity. And unfortunately, this is a very fragile ecosystem. These deep sea organisms, you saw these nodules are down at over 4,000 meters deep. It's cold, it's dark. These organisms are very slow growing, and it takes a very, very long time for these ecosystems to recover once they're disturbed. Trials were done several decades ago where they went down and dug things up, thinking ahead about the possibilities of mine. Trials were done, the seafloor was disturbed. Subsequent expeditions have gone down to look at these areas that were disturbed 26 years ago, and they still have not returned to normal. Some things have come back, some things have not, and the biochemical processing, the animal abundance and diversity is not back to where it was. So it takes an incredibly long time to recover. Compounding the problem is that the effects from the mining are expected to be felt far from the immediate collection zone. Not just that patch of sediment that's being harvested for nodules, but you saw when that vehicle hits the seafloor and as it goes along and scoops up those nodules, it's disturbing layers of sediments many centimeters deep, killing everything in its path and creating plumes of sediment that travel long distances. And we have both the collector plume, which sends a plume along the seafloor, but then also the dewatering plume, which is being released into the midwater and will travel for long distances there too. So these effects we expect to be felt for very long distances away from where the actual activity is taking place. And that includes not just the seafloor, but as I mentioned, the midwaters. And there are magnificent midwater animals, tremendous diversity in the midwater as well. And you can imagine with these plumes of sediment wafting by, this is going to create problems for things that are filter feeders, like these larvaceans, or things that rely on being able to see to catch their prey or to avoid their predators. So many ecological consequences. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the benefit? What is the cost? These metals will be needed for continuing technological advances required to solve some of our pressing environmental issues. But will we be creating worse environmental issues in the process of trying to solve others? What are the alternatives? And we have to ask ourselves, if we must mine the seafloor, how much damage is justifiable? How much seafloor are you willing to destroy to get a new computer? These are the cost-benefit analyses we have to constantly be making and asking ourselves. And ultimately, you have to keep track of who is making these decisions. These are thorny issues, but ones that it pays to keep in mind. Nothing comes for free. So when you think about technological advances and all the nice things we'd like to build, we have to keep in mind the environmental costs as well and make sure that the benefits we're reaping outweigh the costs of the damage we do. So our key points. The ocean provides many types of resources and services. They may be extractive versus non-extractive. We can have renewable or non-renewable, sustainable or unsustainable. Fisheries are renewable, but currently on a path of unsustainability. Many companies are preparing to exploit ocean mineral resources for the metals to fuel the green technology boom. But the environmental consequences could be enormous and far-reaching. So it's a question. Are we able to harvest these non-renewable resources in a way that is sustainable, where the benefits outweigh the costs? Remains to be seen.